Hello everybody, welcome to Die 20. My name is Troy, and today we're going to take a look at Hoard of the Dragon Queen. And I'm going to tell you why you should run this adventure in your campaign. Now, Hoard of the Dragon Queen is one of the OG modules. It's been around since the beginning of 5th edition. It's actually quite interesting that it has a few components of it that's written before the 5e rules were completely finished. So you might notice a few odds and ends about this book that seem a little strange, but we'll get to that a bit later. In this video I'm going to take you through a few things. What I thought of this book, what worked, what didn't work, how this book holds up over time, how durable it is in an actual legitimate campaign, and a few things that you could tweak a little bit to make this run really well for you and your group. So now let's talk about how to really make this work and why you should run this. If you're a first-time DM, or even if you are playing with a lot of people who are playing for the first time, if you've got a group of new players, this is a great adventure. A lot of people talk about the sandbox adventure, and sandboxes are great, but as a new DM or a new player, sometimes the sandbox can get a little big and a little confusing for a lot of players. This thing is definitely a more linear story. It kind of takes you from point A to point B, literally. There's a few offshoots here and there where you can have some sub-quests and side adventures, but for the most part, it's a real overarching story. And the nice thing about an overarching story, that's pretty straightforward. If you're a new DM or you're a new player, you can follow that through and have the satisfaction of completing a storyline, which is one of the reasons I recommend this if you're a new DM. Okay, so first off, this campaign picks up in a small town called Greenest, and they get to what's called a rolling start, where you and your companions find yourself in a cart cruising into the city of Greenest. And the fun thing about this is right away you have to deal with a pile of stuff, including a dragon attack. There's a lot of really fun one-shot solo missions here, like trying to save some town folk and trying to enter a keep and protect the civilians of Greenest. The great thing about this is it really gets your players off and rolling to an action-packed start, which is really good. And then we move into chapter 2 called the Raiders Camp. Here, this is an infiltration mission, which is a lot of fun. It gives your characters a chance to kind of put the combat aside for a little while and slip into a cultist cap undetected, hopefully, and learn a bit about the going-ons of what's happening here. Then we lead into episode 3, the Dragon Hatchery. This is a real typical dungeon crawl here, and what's nice about it is a short crawl. There's some kobolds, some drakes, and a real fun spot where there's a chance for your party to get some black dragon eggs, which is always fun. This is a great chapter as well. Then it moves into episode 4, On the Road. Now, a lot of people here would say that this is one of the toughest chapters to run, and maybe one of the most boring, but in my experience, this was probably one of the most fun chapters in the entire book. It took place over a long stretch of the Sword Coast, over a long period of time, which is something you don't get to do a lot in D&D. It seems like everything is just like one after another, and you complete this huge chunks of work or this big adventure in the span of a few days at times, maybe a few weeks. But this one spans over a few months. So it's a lot of fun, and we'll talk about some tips later of how to make this thing actually flow well as you go on. Chapter 5, Construction Ahead, is where this campaign really starts to come together and move forward towards the end. Finally, after your characters following the Cult of the Dragon all the ways up the Sword Coast, they kind of close in on their location on this old, abandoned, rundown construction depot, for lack of a better word. Here, the players have to use their wits and be a little smart and hopefully discover a tunnel which leads from this roadhouse onto Castle Natara. Natari? Something like that. So this castle here is probably the hardest one to run out of the entire adventure. There's a lot going on here before you get to the castle. There's a large swamp where there's a pile of bullywogs and a pile of lizard folk, and they're just going at it. And they got a whole kind of political aspect going on with the relationship with the cult of the dragon. And if you're not careful, you can kind of get tore up and lost in this whole chaos of this situation leading up to the castle. And once you get in this castle, it's a 3-tier castle where honestly the top and second floor don't prove to add a lot to the story. Most of the happenings are on the first floor and when you go under the first floor into the basement. This is kind of where you might want to push your characters through. Unless you're planning on running the second part of this, which is Tyranny of Dragons, then maybe the sight glass might have a little bit of foreshadowing to a black dragon that might be interesting. If not, I'd recommend just skipping down to the first floor. Because under this castle there's a dungeon. And it's a real fun dungeon because in the center of this dungeon there's a big pool. And there's giant toads and tadpoles. And every time the party disturbs the water, they just keep pretty much coming and coming and coming. This is where you're really going to push through to the end of this book. From there they'll find themselves teleported to Chapter 7, Hunting Lodge. And this Hunting Lodge is where the cult of the dragon kind of has their last stand, their last setup, their last hideaway for the treasure hoard until they bring it to the end destination. Now this Hunting Lodge was a lot of fun to run. By the time your party gets here, they'll be leveled up so well that some cultists and some kobolds won't prove much of a challenge to them, but it'll be a lot of fun to kick indoors and kick some ass. However, there is a troll, Thespian the troll, in this chapter. And this guy can put up quite a fight. It's a lot of fun to run him, so I would definitely have him kick in the doors and fight if you can. From here, this book moves into Chapter 8, Castle in the Clouds. This is probably one of the most fun chapters you can run in this entire book, and it's great because it's right at the end, so it kind of ends with a bit of a climax. The party moves into the small town of Parnas that's basically under complete control of the cultists at this point, so they've still kind of got to play it a little careful and sneak in here, but they can kind of kick the doors in and go guns a-blazing here too if they want. They just got to figure out how to play it. Either way, it's a lot of fun, this little town. Some interesting things going on there. One of the most interesting things is there's a stable of wyverns there, so for some reason the castle flies off before your party can get there, you can bring them to the stables and hopefully pick those wyverns up to reach this castle. And then it finally brings us to the castle, this big floating castle. Now, this castle in the sky is dangerous but fun. A careful party shouldn't have any problem moving through it. Maybe with a little diplomacy for some of the giants on the first floor. Maybe try to sweet talk the owner, the cloud giant that owns this castle. But in the pit of this castle there's a lot of fun. There's a white dragon, there's some red wizards, and it can make for a great epic final battle. Now let's just take a moment here and talk about how this book is actually constructed and put together. It's, of course, got that classic D&D semi-gloss look, hardcover, thick cardstock paper, even though it's one of the first books. But let's really talk about this book. So if you're in a D&D campaign and you're a DM, you're going to be tabbing through this book, you're going to be looking at it, you're going to be playing, you're going to drop that shit on the ground. That's going to happen. But how does it hold up? Well, these books can take a knocking. I've had this thing through the airport about 20 times, in my luggage, in my carry-on, in my laptop book. This thing has really took a beating, and you can see that even the corners are holding up, the spine is still intact. Most of these pages are in pristine condition, and like everybody knows, your hands are full of pizza and chips and everything else, but it holds up. But I mean, if you're playing D&D and you're playing in D&D with a group of people, there's one ultimate test that this book needs to go through. I mean, everybody knows they're going to spill a bit of beer. So there's one for me, and one for all the homies, the cultists that are going to die along the way. And this has happened a few times. Oh shit. They've got it wiped down. No problems. Can hold up the beer spills. I mean, that's what's really important here. Well, maybe two for me. Now, if we want to talk about some things you should do to kind of tweak this and make this run a little better, one of the things I would recommend doing is there's a villain that presents herself in episode 1 for Rune Death. And there's a villain that presents herself later on, Talus the White. Now, one of the biggest complaints I would have about this book is there's a lot of bad guys. There's actually more bad guys than there needs to be. So what I did is I took those two characters and I blended them to one person instead of two different people. That way the characters knew and the players knew who this bad guy was through the whole story. So when they finally caught up to her and they confronted her later on in this book, they remembered her from the beginning and they had that history of trying to track her down instead of just introducing a new bad guy at the end. There's also a couple red wizards in here. I would recommend kind of amalgamating them into one person as well. So my first recommendation would be to kind of cut down on the bad guys, consolidate them a little bit, make it a little easier for the players to understand and follow along with who's who, because players sometimes get lost in all these NPCs. So tip here for running Greenest also is to have some townsfolk present during this big battle in the keep. That blue dragon can be real nasty. It could totally take out the party right away. So what I did is I had a lot of extra guards stationed around the keep walls who was also firing their arrows at this dragon, trying to ward it away. And that actually worked out quite well because I brought the dragon in, swooped down, killed a pile of random townsfolk and guards, and really put the fear in the players. So a little few tips here for chapter 1. Chapter 2, the Raiders Camp. Here, the biggest tip I can give is prepare your players leading into this chapter to take it the stealthy route, to try to blend in and not so much kick the doors down and blaze in here, but infiltrate. And a way you can do that is perhaps have them capture a few cultists back in chapter 1, have the governor in chapter 1 explain to them that the cultists are dangerous and it might be better to sneak in than bust their way in. Or if the players do some scouting and they see this gigantic complex before they get there, kind of make them aware that infiltration may be the best method here. Also, one of the most difficult parts about this is when they get in the Raiders camp, they'll find the entrance to the Dragon Hatchery most likely, and they'll probably try to sneak in there right away. So if you can somehow maneuver it so perhaps the party members hear that this large gathering of cultists in this camp are going to kind of go off later on and have an opportunity to explore this without such a gigantic pile of people on the outside, try to slip that in there. Maybe they'll overhear a few cultists speaking or conversing. But that's a little recommendation I would have there. Stealth, try to lead your players to stealth this one, if you're afraid you're going to kill them all. Now in episode 3, when they finally do make their way into this underground complex, it's a lot of fun here. One thing I would probably warn you about, there's a few berserkers in here that can be real tough. They can put up quite a fight, so maybe just be prepared to realize that. It might be fun here to have your party members kill off one of the people that they've been chasing, perhaps someone like Legden Rosa. It'll give them the satisfaction of maybe catching one of these bad guys and give them a bit of redemption for the town of Greenest, a bit of revenge here. So it could be fun to throw in one of these bad guys, or maybe even Faroon if you feel like it, to give that sense of accomplishment to your players here. So chapter 4 on the road was one of the most fun chapters around. It takes you from the southern part of the Sword Coast up towards the middle of the Sword Coast. It's a long journey. It spans over a few months. Now, the tip that I could give you here, it would be a good idea to maybe make a list of days. Say every 3 or 4 days, or maybe every 5 or 6 days. So maybe day 7, day 15, day 21. You can have planned events, and you can sort of like montage the in-between downtime, unless of course your players are trying to do something. And there's a lot of really fun, really interesting encounters during this trek. And not only is it interesting for this campaign, but this is a great resource for travel in a different campaign, or maybe a home game that you're running. Some of these encounters here, like animal abuse, Fungus Humongous, the Golden Stag, these can be a lot of fun. And you can stretch this chapter out over 3, 4, 2, 1 games, however you feel like it. I would recommend pulling this out over maybe 3 or 4 games if you can, because it gives that sense of like this long travel, and you can also have a lot of fun with these little encounters here. And a good thing about Hoard of the Dragon Queen, because the story is pretty, we start here, we chase the cultists, we find out what they're doing. You don't have a big loss of information or confusing, or the players don't start to forget what they're actually doing if you have a few sessions here where you get to stretch out something like this. So chapter 5, construction ahead. One of the tips that I should share with you with this is that you want to make sure that your characters find that tunnel which leads them onward to the castle in the next chapter. Without that, they're going to be hard pressed to kind of find where this hoard of treasure is going. Now, one thing that your players might start to think is they might start to think that when they get here that this is the final destination for the treasure, and it kind of gives you a bunch of false endings from here moving forward. This roadhouse, the castle, the hunting lodge, but finally the castle in the clouds is actually where the ending is for this entire campaign. So you might want to try to have your players hear the cultists talk a little bit about how the treasure is moving from here, or when they investigate this entire area, make sure that they really don't find any signs of treasure except for perhaps that which is going to lead them towards the secret tunnel. So chapter 6, as I discussed earlier, I wasn't a big fan of this chapter. Now, if you're big into Diablo style dungeon crawls, this could be a great chapter for you. But as I said earlier, I would recommend just trying to get your party into the bottom of this castle as fast as possible. The problem with this is there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of bad guys. There's a real potential TPK here. Now, of course, if your players want to check out the middle and upper layer, by all means, go ahead and do that. But if they're feeling wary and they're anxious to catch the cultists at this point, I would kind of tend to lead them downstairs as fast as possible. Okay, little tips and hints for Chapter 7, the Hunting Lodge. Here I would make sure that your characters has the chance to kill some of the leaders of the cultists here, and at least give them the opportunity to capture or question some cultists, because there might be some key information that they're missing at this point. And if you give it to them in Chapter 7, in the terms of, oh, the treasure has a final destination, and they hear the name of the town, or that perhaps they capture Talus or one of the other major players here and question that person directly, there may be even a chance they could form an alliance here. And like I said earlier, running this troll is a lot of fun here, so if you can find a way to fit that guy in, I'd recommend doing that. Now, when we move into the final chapter, one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give here, get a little extra time to have that short or long rest to make sure that they're good to go when they finally get on this castle. Now, this will allow for a really cool moment here where you can have the party find these wyverns and have like an aerial battle as they make their way towards this castle in the sky. This is a pretty unique experience because this castle can be quite the trek. There's a lot going on here. I would recommend that your characters be at least level 7, 8 for sure by the time they get here. There's a lot going on here when you have to deal with cultists and ogres and giants. A little bit of diplomacy in this chapter. If you can push for that, or if you can lean towards that, would be very helpful. If the party can befriend these giants and get them on their side, you can have the giants help them in the fight. So yeah, Hoard of the Dragon Queen. Run it, it's a lot of fun. So guys, if you like this video or you'd like to see me do some more reviews, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. I figured out how to put a button down here, maybe the button's down there. Go ahead and give that a smash. And I'd like to hear from you. If you guys have played in or ran this campaign setting, what did you find the most difficult part or the most interesting part? Go ahead and let me know in the comments. Thanks, cheers.